Hey folks, this is Kalani. With the Shadowlands Alpha seemingly getting a new build every week, testing is chugging along quite nicely. We got to explore Revendreth last week, and this week we'll probably get a new build including the major hub of the expansion, Oribos. But while we wait for that weekly build, Ian sat down with Zoltan on his Twitch stream for yet another interview. I don't think we've had this many community interviews in such a short period of time, but that means we have another info dump on the progression of Shadowlands and some answers to a few key questions that I know have been on a lot of players' minds. So let's break down this interview and extract all the delicious nuggets of info that we can. Before we jump in, if you're interested in seeing some alpha exploration live, we've booted up the good old stream over at twitch.tv/KalaniTV. If you have a moment, swing by and say hi. Alrighty, we actually have a lot to cover, and it's quite a broad spectrum of topics, so I'll try to make this as neat as possible. As we look into the future of BFA and the start of Shadowlands, the pre-patch will become more and more important. When asked what happens in the pre-patch for Shadowlands, Ian said we'll have to wait and see for specific details, but the overarching story will cover what happens to the undead when the Helm of Dominion is broken. We were always told that there must always be a Lich King, and without one, the Scourge would rampage across the continent. I guess that's probably going to be most of what happens, and the pre-patch event will mainly take place in Northrend and Icecrown. We will get to see how certain story points wrap up too, including the hunt for Nathanos. I'm sure the novel that's being released before Shadowlands will cover a lot of the story, but some parts might be left open for the game to finish for once. Pre-patch will also introduce all of the system changes, the big one being the level squish and leveling changes, so I'm sure a lot of players are excited for that too. Looking even further into the future, a question about expansions cropped up. Basically, how many expansions do you have in the timeline ready to go? Ian said they plan about 2 expansions in advance, so the idea of Shadowlands and us all visiting the afterlife was on the table and likely selected for an expansion candidate while Legion was ongoing. That means they've definitely been working on this for way longer than we probably thought, and they have an idea of where we're going next and after that. So look out for all those little hints that probably will be in Shadowlands somewhere, which might be why the alpha looks so polished right now too. An interesting tidbit, apparently Bwonsamdi wasn't really supposed to be a major character in the Shadowlands expansion, but seeing as everyone loved him in BFA, he was brought forward into the expansion with a larger part to play. So if you love an NPC, be sure to make that known. We might just see more of them in the future. And then the last solid question about expansions and timelines was about the current situation with lockdowns and work from home stuff and how that's affecting Blizzard, with the key question being, will Shadowlands be delayed at all? The good news is that the progress on Alpha is continuing at a decent pace. It took them about a week, apparently, for the team to transition over to remote working and working from home, but the train is still chugging along nicely. The dev team is pretty confident they can still release Shadowlands in 2020, whether that's October, November or December, we have no idea. But if you are worried about a potential delay into the next year for a Shadowlands 2021, well, you needn't worry anymore. Shadowlands 2020 release still confirmed. There were also some questions about the endgame for Shadowlands. They don't have everything set in stone yet, but they do know that world quests will still be around. So if you enjoy opening your map, seeing all the world quests available and knocking them out one by one, you should be pretty happy. It sounds like emissaries will not be returning in Shadowlands though. They will be replaced by something called callings from your covenant. They're similar enough to be compared to emissaries, but they're going to be more than just complete X amount of world quests. I wonder if they'll send you out to specific zones, or maybe to a specific other covenant to gather intel, reagents, or maybe just cause a bit of havoc. Having different callings depending on your covenant could be really interesting as well, because all of the covenants work in different ways and have different values and beliefs. Hopefully they will draw from that difference to create an interesting daily activity. There is also something called Covenant Sanctums, which will be important in the long term and will be leveling them up. That sounds kind of like garrisons or class halls from Legion. Another base of operations could be interesting if it's done right, and again, the different covenants will have different sanctums. Yet another choice you're going to have to make when choosing which covenant to represent. To level up a sanctum, we'll be collecting anima from a variety of sources and lost souls from Torghast and the Maw. We can actually collect these souls right now on Alpha. Every time you free a soul, you get a soul added to this currency. There are also anima powers that grant 10 freed souls all at once, so I guess this currency will be very important in your Sanctum progression, somehow, some way. Covenants will also provide you with soul binds, another way to customize your character. You can swap soul binds whenever you want, making them quite a bit more flexible than other systems we've seen, like Azerite traits. You start with 2 soul binds in your covenant, and you can unlock a third by completing a quote-unquote epic questline, something else to look forward to at max level. And then we'll also have raids, PvP, dungeons, and Mythic Plus dungeons, Torghast, legendary crafting, and the Maw Zone. It sounds like Endgame has a lot of options right now in Shadowlands, and they're not even finished with it yet. Speaking of the Maw Zone, apparently we'll be seeing that pop up on the alpha in the next couple of weeks. I think Oribos will probably be next, and then we have the 2 other zones to test as well, Ardenweald and Maldraxxus. If they do the Maw before those 2 zones, we could see what the Maw is all about very soon indeed. Ian said we'll actually start off in the Maw, leading our forces against the Jailer, and then we end up in Oribos before we start our journey through the 4 Shadowlands zones. So the Maw is going to be both our introduction experience to this expansion, as well as a max level zone. We'll go back to the Maw every now and then while leveling, but when we get to 60 it becomes an endgame zone where we can spend time under the watchful eye of the Jailer, whatever that means. This Jailer chap seems to like watching us. It's a little weird. From the BlizzCon preview that we had, apparently the Jailer will actually send monsters to hunt you down if you spend too long in the Maw zone, so that's going to be really interesting to see how it's all implemented and how it works out. While we're talking about the Jailer, do you remember this chap that was data mined a while back? We thought he might be the Jailer, or just some other Jailer mob or elite or something. Well, Ian confirmed today that this is in fact the Jailer himself, and I can't say I'm too surprised. That is a very cool model. Too cool for some lackey hidden away somewhere in a tower. So this is the big bad of the expansion. Or so they would have us believe. I have a feeling Sylvanas isn't just going to sit back and watch her little pet get beaten up. Now, I mentioned the legendary crafting briefly, and while we still don't have any solid info on how it's actually going to work, Ian did provide us with a few new scraps of info. He was asked how long it would take to get 1 legendary, to which he answered, they're still figuring it out, but 1 every 2 to 3 weeks sounds about right, kind of similar to Legion, that's what he said, but with much more control, obviously. Legendaries in Legion were completely random from almost any source of loot in the game, but in Shadowlands you will craft your own legendary, so instead of getting 1 random drop every 2 to 3 weeks, it will instead take you those 2 to 3 weeks to collect up the necessary ingredients and reagents to actually put the legendary together yourself. That includes collecting a base item for the slot it will go in, the legendary effect itself, items to fix the stats on your legendary, and then I'm assuming a bunch of extra essences or anima or something to actually power the legendary. That's all going to take about 2 to 3 weeks if the plan doesn't change. So not too bad really, especially when you more or less choose exactly what legendary you want to make. He also added that we will be limited to equipping just 1 legendary in Shadowlands, no info on whether that will be expanded upon later on, just that we only start with 1. Now, another question that keeps cropping up is about covenants and how often you can swap between them, and apparently joining a different covenant isn't the hard part. The plan is for leaving your covenant to be easy and joining another covenant to be easy as well, but trying to rejoin a covenant that you've already left is going to be the hard part. So if you start with Bastion and Kyrian and fancy the swap to Revendreth and Venthia, that's fine, but if you want to swap back to Bastion, that might be a more lengthy, drawn-out process. That would certainly be more ideal than swapping between covenants taking a lot of time, in my opinion, but it doesn't really fix the problem of abilities being good in different areas of the game. The main complaint that I've seen from a lot of players is wanting to freely use any of the Covenant abilities, and the current iteration just doesn't let you do that, but depending on how Covenants are set up, that might not be feasible at all. Ian added that they learned a lot from the restrictions they tried to set on changing Azerite traits and Azerite gear, and how hardcore players will continue to pay an increasing cost, even though it was intended to ward them off at some point. I mean, some of the raiders were paying millions of gold to reset their Azerite traits, so obviously they weren't weren't put off at all, so maybe they're just playing around with what kind of restrictions they can get away with, though remember that the dev team has said if they can't get this right and it all falls into shambles and covenants just aren't working, then they might just open up the covenant system to allow you to change as often as you want. Time will tell, but I think having the restriction on rejoining a covenant you already left is less punishing than restricting trying to join a different covenant altogether. That way you can join one, test it out, and if you fancy another one and don't really care for what you've already picked, you can just happily hop around them until you find one that you will settle with. But if you make a bad choice and you end up regretting it, that's where you're going to end up paying. And then the last topic that was touched on relative to Endgame was the question of whether we would see any new Mythic Plus affixes. The answer was a little grey. They want to continue with the idea of seasonal affixes, but it sounds like they haven't gotten around to actually designing the first one yet, or it's just not ready to be shared at any rate. Ian also said that they might redesign one or two affixes if they can come up with something good, and then retune some of the ones which aren't quite as fun. But by the sounds of things, we might not see too many changes overall, except for that seasonal affix. Apparently Mythic Plus is one of the last systems on their list to play around with and make changes to, because they need to make sure the dungeons themselves are actually working properly before layering more features on top of them, which is a smart move really. The last thing we want is a dungeon that just doesn't work or doesn't work with a certain new affix. We did have a lot of bugs early on with the start of BFA in dungeons. I'd rather not have a repeat of that. It's not all about the end game though. The topic of leveling was brought up too. Specifically, is leveling too fast on the alpha right now? I think 1 to 50 was done in 7 hours or something bonkers, and Ian replied that 7 hours is probably a bit too fast. They do want leveling in Shadowlands to be faster than it is in live right now, but probably not 7 hours fast. The values are not final on the alpha as you might expect, so keep an eye on experience changes from levels 1 to 120 or 1 to 50 when the squish finally comes through. I imagine they would probably just do it at the same time so we can't compare numbers directly, but at the end of the day, we're literally just going to have to wait until pre-patch. They could change numbers the week before pre-patch lands, and we would have no idea, but just remember that 7 hours from 1 to 50 is too fast, but Shadowlands will still be faster than what we have right now. Character customization was brought up too. The first question was about the blue-eyed blood elves and then basically getting the high elf look. The blue eyes for blood elves that were data mined are for NPCs only, apparently, and will not be featured for blood elves as an actual customization option or an eye color option. So if you were hoping you could finally turn your eyes blue and pretend to be a high elf in the horde, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you. No blue eyes for now, which means no high elves for now. And then the idea of allied race customization was brought up too. Humans are getting a huge number of different options for faces, skin colours, scars, eye colours, hairstyles, all wonderful additions. But what about other races? Ian said their focus is on the original races for Shadowlands launch, which tells me humans and blood elves will be in there guaranteed, but character customization is an ongoing project that will never just stop and be done. They can always add more, but by the sounds of things, not every race will be covered with 9.0 and Shadowlands, and some might have to wait until 9.1, 9.2, maybe even 9.3, or perhaps even the next expansion. Allied races are probably last on the to-do list because of how recently they were introduced. Great news if you play humans or dwarves or night elves or any of the other original races, not so great if you play Vulpera. I am excited to hear that customization will continue to be an ongoing project though. You can never have enough hairstyles. That's all the key information that we can glean from this most recent interview, but there was one extra addition caught on Twitter. The 1 per server Demon Hunter restriction will be lifted, gone, with Shadowlands, but not until the pre-patch hits live servers. That's the point where Demon Hunters no longer start at level 98, and in Shadowlands in the pre-patch they will start down at level 8 alongside the Death Knights and basically every other allied race. Seeing as there's no huge level advantage at that point, the 1 per server restriction doesn't make much sense either. So if you want more than one Demon Hunter on your server, that will be a thing, but not until pre-patch arrives. Obviously also if you want to skip the leveling with your Demon Hunter, make sure to make it before pre-patch so it starts at level 98 instead. Or, it's probably a good idea to get it through the introduction experience. Not sure how that would break it, but get your Demon Hunters done if you don't want to level them, basically. And that's all the news we have for now. What do you think of the endgame potential in Shadowlands from what we've seen so far? Legendary crafting, Torghast, the Maw Zone, Covenants and Sanctums, Soulbinds, a new type of emissary quest, raids, dungeons and PvP? That sounds like a lot of content, right? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. If you want to explore the alpha alongside us, you can catch us live at twitch.tv/KalaniTV. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon and our subscribers on Twitch. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find links in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.